All right. Welcome everybody to our webinar this evening. Today's webinar, we're going to be discussing the topic Innovating Cloud Native Cyber Resilience and Stumbling into Security Chaos Engineering. My name is Kennedy Torkura. I'm one of the founders of Mitigant and also the CTO. And today the webinar is going to be something around 40 minutes discussion, and we're going to have some other like 15 minutes for questions and answers afterwards. Today's webinar, we're super excited about it. Basically, we have our guest speaker, Jay. Jay has been in the industry for quite some time, so he's seen a lot of evolution of technologies, of all the things that happen in the cybersecurity industry, which is heavily influenced by the wider computer science, or let's say computer technology industry. He's seen a lot of that. So today he's going to be sharing with us some of that experience, which will be definitely useful. I'm super excited about what he's going to be telling us. I think just for the sake of housekeeping, you can definitely type in the chat if you have any questions. If you have anything you want to ask, you can just throw out the questions in the chat, and we will pick it up and try to address it as we continue to discuss, or maybe we will just do that together at the end of the session during the Q&A session. So let's get started. I will allow Jay to introduce himself because I can't do that as good as he can. So Jay, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience? Just tell us who you are, what you've been doing, what you're up to, and the cool stuff you've and kind of cool experience you've had.
Sure, thank you, Kennedy, and thanks for having me. So my name is Jay Thoden van Velzen. I'm strategic advisor to the Chief Security Officer at SAP. I've been doing that for a year. Before that, I was in a group called Multi-Cloud Security Operations and led something like 3.5 years of secure cloud transformation programs within the company. Before that, I did product security within digital supply chain and industrial IoT. Did that for about 4 or 5 years, which also included product security aspects. And before that, I was technology consulting, mostly in analytics. So I've seen a lot in the last, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but about 25 plus in the tech year industry.
Yeah, thank you so much for that very comprehensive introduction. It's really impressive, when I think lately there's been this whole discussion around, the way working in cybersecurity gets more complicated, and people actually getting burnt out and actually leaving cybersecurity for other fields that seem to be cooler. So it's impressive to see you've been in it and you're still enjoying it for this length of time. So
oh gosh, this is the best time of my entire career. It's maybe also the most stressful and most high velocity time in my career. But I think we actually have, I think you see sort of burnout in some areas, but enthusiasm in others, right? Like I see this as an opportunity using capabilities in the cloud that we never had in data centers. That allow us to do things that for 30 years before we haven't really been able to solve, right? Like there's things that you can do using the capabilities of the cloud that can dramatically improve your security posture at a relatively low effort. I often call the cloud sort of like security squared, right? Like if you're doing it well, you're going to be much better than you ever were. If you don't know what you're doing, it's going to be worse because you basically bring bad practices into the landscape, and you probably misconfigured your storage buckets and your network as well, right? But if you have the discipline and you take advantage of the capabilities that the cloud provides, that makes it substantially easier. I think the struggle is more to convince people of that fact and start adopting cloud native development practices, deployment options, um, uh, uh, deployment as code, but also policy and security as code, that then can help demonstrate that it actually becomes achievable and less painful at the same time.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I like it the way you described it, because I think different people have different, let's say, impressions of the cloud. Of course, developers or DevOps, they seem to enjoy, or let's say appreciate, the benefits more than security folks. And today we hear not just about cloud security, we also hear about cloud native security. And so I've been in discussion with people who have been in the industry for like 20 years, and they come asking, what is cloud native security? What are you guys doing? What's different here? And for me, maybe because I kind of joined the profession when it was already, the wheel was already turning, it's easier for me to kind of really know, because I don't have the insights of what really happened before. So I think it's still a topic that people like to hear more, like what's traditional.
Let me give you an
cybersecurity.
example.
Yeah.
Right? Like when I started as a consultant, then quite often data centers or servers sat in somebody's office basement in the corporate office, or like a particular floor. And you would get into the room, chill to like 16 degrees. So you were there with your coat on. If you're lucky, there was a stool that you could sit on. Otherwise, you're sitting, and you get a keyboard tray to come out of a rack. You ask it to open the CD tray, and somewhere CD tray pops out, and you put the software pack CD in there, and you do installation. Forward a couple of years, let's say 5 years or so, you were doing the same thing, just with remote data centers. SSH in, you like FTP or SCP a copy of the software package, or you download it from the machine itself from some central site, and you do an installation, right? Now you get to the cloud, and all of that model actually changes. Now you can still do it the old way in a sort of lift and shift approach. But what you can also do is prepare your Helm charts, prepare your image, and tell the cloud API, please instantiate this landscape for me. And that is a completely different thing from having to touch a landscape yourself, kick off an installation, and even sort of automation scripts to do that, like have a bunch of shell scripts that essentially do the same thing. There's a level of automation, but you're still manipulating sort of deployed servers that are already there, rather than, prepare your installation and then the deployment strategy of how you either replace entirely or like do a rolling update of the landscape. I've asked people a lot of the times that are still talking about patching in the cloud and like maintenance windows and so on. It's like, when was the last time you got a Google message that said down for maintenance? Maybe you've never even seen one like that, right?
No,
Like,
no.
or Amazon.com, it's like, sorry, we're down for maintenance, come back in 15 minutes, right? Like nobody has seen that. So that is the work that you have to adjust to, right? I think that's also how you get to sort of cyber resilience rather than like HA and disaster recovery, which I think is a really big change in the industry.
Yeah, that's really, really nice. I think for me, one of the, when trying to really understand cloud native security, some years back, the Kubernetes security team came up with these 4 C's of cloud native security, which they talked about the 4 abstraction layers: the cloud, the code, the orchestration layer, and this kind of really made it more, let's say, more tangible. Of course, not everybody you don't need these 4 layers before you say it's cloud native security, so to say. It might just be even one of them, just even the cloud, but you're now dealing with containers, you're dealing with Lambda, you're dealing with all these serverless workloads, databases, and it's already cloud native. But of course, if it's full-fledged, you see that you have multiple abstraction layers. Then the tooling becomes an issue because you're using a vulnerability scanner, and it can only give you security about the code layer. It can't go further than that. So for you to know what's happening at the control plane of the infrastructure, of the cloud infrastructure, you need another team, right? And then for you to see into the containers, you still need another team. So it becomes really, let's say, complicated, or let's say complex. And then I think that's where you know that, yes, this is like cloud native security.
But that's also where you have to start like taking complexity away, right? Like I think a lot of the times people are looking at cloud as sort of in addition to what they already have. So it becomes a question of like increasing their attack surface, right? Like everybody I know is hybrid cloud in some way and multi-cloud in some way, by choice or by, circumstance. But by looking at that way, I think you're complicating the problem, right? Like I'm not saying that the problem isn't big and complex, but you can compartmentalize it a little bit and do things that make a massive difference. Like we did a couple of things that, I think still is more related to the kind of company than SAP is, rather than it was ever a security consideration. But I think it was 2017, a new organization was created in SAP called Multi-Cloud that would facilitate the different teams getting cloud accounts, centralized billing. And with that, we, at that point, there was like maybe a couple of thousand or a couple of hundred cloud accounts. So we were there soon enough to make a decision that before the really big wave started from, about 2,000 to 17,000 today, that we had certain things in place. And by doing that cross-charging of central billing and central cost negotiations and discount negotiation with the cloud providers, that was the business driver. But what accidentally happened alongside with that is that we forced everybody to be in an SAP organization in each of the cloud providers that we run, so AWS, Azure, GCP, and Ali Cloud, AWS China, and Azure China. And that everything always had an owner, while at the same time you couldn't expense your own credit card or corporate credit card cloud costs through that. So that wipes out all shadow IT immediately, because you basically have a corporate violation and you are left with the cost. And at the same time, once we really started to get going with the cloud security programs, could use the fact that everything was already organized in organizations to use organizational policy capabilities in the cloud providers to deploy tooling, to set up guardrails, to ensure that either auto remediation was in place or the resource couldn't even be created in a non-compliant fashion, right? And that's kind of what I mean with the magic of like taking some of that complexity away. Because even if people do it wrong, there's a whole bunch of baselines that at least will close the admin ports, right? That will at least make sure that encryption is in place. And then people get annoying emails that hopefully they learn from and stuff. But like that kind of capability never really existed in the data center. And what it also does, and this is really fascinating to think of, I'm very obsessed about like the psychology of the attacker reaction to a particular type of landscape, right? Because a lot of our tooling is deployed through the cloud API, like a CNAP or like the pulling the audit logs or other scans that we run, they're not present in the landscape. So suppose somebody gets in and go like, well, where's the security tooling that I'm going to turn off? Like there's some runtime stuff, but it's not like the most, what we entirely rely on, right? So suddenly an attacker drops in a well-configured landscape where the security tooling is absent and the log trails are central.
Yeah.
What would be your reaction? Like, look, if it's all automated, don't care that much because there's not that many endpoints to hit, and or there's either very many, but they're all on 443 and other protections in place, right? But I think the idea of actually getting in and then looking around, going, I'm probably being watched, right? I think it's a really interesting one, especially when your landscape looks very different compared to, what you might encounter otherwise.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think so just for the sake of the audience, bearing in mind that in the audience there could be people who are just at the verge of starting their security transformation journey, or they are somewhere in the middle, or they have finished phase 1 and they're now like going to phase 2. I think it would be great if you will just give a little bit description of what you saw or what you did at SAP. I think from the blog you wrote, of course, you've written a lot of them. I think I remembered you mentioned something around when the Capital One hack occurred. That was 2019. I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of companies, because it was like, well, Capital One that has all it takes gets hacked by this small, by this very little vulnerability. So like, what was it just before the whole transformation, agenda kicked off at SAP, and like, how did it occur? What were the steps that you took?
So this was the Capital One media hype started, I think, late July 2019. And I had started in the multi-cloud team just a couple of months before, and worked with people there that had started, but the teams were fairly small. There was some initial tooling deployed, but there wasn't a whole lot of like oversight. So it was like a tool was deployed, was made available to teams to make use of. The landscape wasn't very big, but there wasn't, certainly not the type of accountability processes that we put in place afterwards. What happened was our chief security officer, Tim McKnight, had just started at the beginning of the year, and I brought in Richard Puckett, who's now at Boeing, in June, and we met in his first week, and was supposed to be an introduction, and I started asking some questions about like, hey, we should probably do something more with this. And that at least sort of created a relationship. But what we couldn't foresee was that only, let's say 4 to 6 weeks later, this thing would kick off. And as a security professional, I would have to admit that when it first came out, I was literally like, oh, another one, and went on with the order of my day. But it hit the business community for some reason. Like, we can't predict how this happens. Sometimes you get one of these that's like bam, and then suddenly your CEO is starting asking questions of like, this can't happen here, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, So that kicked off what turned out to be about 3.5 years of cloud security improvement programs. In the first year, we brought the the high severity cloud security alerts down by 96% in 1 year in 2020. Wow. Since then, we've been building upon that and sort of adding what we call like medium, and sort of try to maintain essentially a 99%-ish. We just switched tools, so like the target will change a little bit because of how it gets counted. But for everything that we scan for, we like divide that by the resources involved that are being scanned, and how many are compliant and how many are not. And like we kind of hover at this 99%. Basically what it means, like if we hit 99%, we sharpen the rule set, so it drops a couple of percentage down, and then we use it as a way to essentially continuously get better and tackle like the next problem that we see.
Oh, okay, cool. So I think just when we think about this whole technological transformation, I think it's always nice to balance it with the technology, people, and processes. So you've touched on technology. You talked a little bit about processes, like playing around with the metrics and so forth. But the people side of it, like, can you give a clue into what happened in terms of manpower? Did you have people who could do this? Did you have to hire new people? You mentioned one person came in, but that's the top. How about like the engineers, the guys who are actually fixing what were the decisions that were taken?
So this is like, let me add a bit of context first, because otherwise the answer makes less sense. So if you think of the timeline, when I came in 2019, SAP was already in the process of a migration of a lot of the solutions to either public cloud or to an SAP own run cloud, but it wasn't considered fast enough, while at the same time those who were already in the cloud were growing very rapidly. So in October 2020, our CEO announced to the market that we were going to go through an accelerated migration exercise where we were given 9 months to move everything that wasn't yet in public cloud or in this SAP new cloud, had to move.
Wow.
I think we closed something like, don't hold me on the number, but like the amount of co-locations and like acquired data centers and so on that had grown in the previous 10 years, much of that was shut down and moved into these new landscapes. I think we're down to like minimal things, some things that either are going to get retired eventually or are sort of like internal systems that we run ourselves.
Yeah.
So, and in that time frame, so over that particular time frame from October 2020 till the end of last year, we grew from 6,000 cloud accounts across the multiple public cloud providers to 15,000.
Yeah.
And then 17,000 today. So that growth keeps going. So did this require like a significant people effort? And then saying like, oh, and we have to do all these security things at the same time, when everybody's just literally going like, but I need to move this from over here to over there in kind of a sensible way and onboard my customers that are running over there into the new landscape and handle that in a responsible way without like violating GDPR or compliance rules or anything like that. This was, I was in a meeting at the beginning of this year, so after it was done, with two executives, so the BISO and the head of the line of business, in a security review that we do periodically. And I was there, and the three of us basically agreed that it was the hardest thing that we had ever done in our entire careers. Like the fact that it even works and worked successfully and in a reasonable, controlled and secure manner is actually completely remarkable, considering we're talking about like 20 different business units, tens of thousands of developers, a couple of thousand of people that are either full-time or part-time dedicated to security, and make this transition from, what was in some respects largely a software company that started certain cloud services to one that is now essentially baked on the cloud, and where we're bringing those that were running our software on premise into the cloud landscape where we're fully responsible for running them. And because it's SaaS applications, right? Like business applications are not IaaS or PaaS, right?
Yeah.
Like you have the full responsibility other than maybe the user management and configuration that the customer does. So all infrastructure, all encryption, all network flows, keeping it up and running, making sure that you have the recovery capabilities in case something happens. That's a big change for everybody, for our customers, for ourselves, for literally everybody pretty much in the ecosystem.
I mean, it just describing the entire setup, how everything was happening, makes me into, it just gives me that picture, when you said security engineering amid chaos. I can imagine how, how it is in such a setup where you got product owners, you got SREs, and all of that, just thinking about moving workloads from data centers to the cloud. And then you have the security engineers come in and say, by the way, you have to do this should be done, and and in the end it works well. So
and this is also where like central services, whether it's like security services, infrastructure services, platform services, really make the difference, right? Like being able to do, as I said, sort of, centralized logging or deployment of security tooling so that the teams that are going through this big transformation, it's like, okay, that box is ticked somewhere, right? Like, yeah, I need to get any alerts that come out of it, but that's I wouldn't say solved, but like that's really big thing that gets done, right? Like putting MFA on all cloud admin users is a massive improvement to the security of the entire landscape, and nobody has to do anything about that other than load a particular authenticator on their phones, right? Like those type of things, secure infrastructure, golden images, secure pipelines through our golden path hyperspace team. We have secure platforms, secure serverless infrastructure through our Kima, so that the team literally can just focus on the code that they deploy. And look, there's a massive legacy tail, and everybody is on different stages of cloud native, if you like. But the more you can help teams out through these central services so that they don't have to deal with that. Like, if a team is super highly sophisticated, cloud native, and they go like, look, I want to build my own CI/CD pipeline that works exactly for my team. It's like, go right ahead. Here are some rules that you have to stick to. We'll scan your landscape, make sure it's good, right? But there's lots of teams that, when you talk, it's very easy to talk about DevOps. It's a very different situation to actually figure out, or navigate that landscape of different options, open source, etc., that you have. And our hyperspace team does a fantastic job in saying, like, look, are you building this kind of thing or building this kind of thing? And we'll set you up the CI/CD pipeline with a GitHub repository, and like, so you can get going, that you can then further extend or modify, or even if you want, ultimately move off of. But we don't have to care that much about the ones that know how to do things. We have to take care of the ones that don't, right? And the more you can help them and enable them, the better it is. The developer teams have to judge whether we do a good job at that or not. But you hope that through continuous dialogue, you serve them as well as you can, and work on the things that you still have to do better.
Absolutely. So, I think you've talked a lot about typical cloud security. How you went through the journey, how you were able to take care of security problems and cloud native security problems, and now knowing fully well that we both of us know that when you start talking about resiliency, cyber resiliency, it's like a stretch forward. Like most companies say, hey, we're not doing that. It's not it's not yet time to do that. Like they put it as a maturity thing. Like you need to be at certain spot before you can even think about it. So in your own perspective, like, was there a time when you said, hey, it's now time to begin to think about resiliency? Or was it like out of the box, kind of like, okay, you heard something about resiliency before in traditional data centers, you talked about disaster recovery, and you say, okay, this thing needs to be transferred to a cloud native, resiliency setup, and we have to do X, Y, Z, or what was the plan like, in terms of cyber resiliency?
I think first of all, it's interesting, like where the term kind of comes from, right? Like, I don't remember people using the word resilient systems so much, say 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It was more about like disaster recovery. So, or high availability, like can you fail over? Do you have like an active or an active passive system?
Yeah.
And you could argue that that was about resilience, but I don't think it was quite the same as, for instance, what I saw when I did digital supply chain, manufacturing, OT, IoT security, where you have much more sort of this thinking of like stuff will go wrong. We'll try very hard through engineering for it not to go wrong. But if it could go wrong, how long can we continue on to get somewhere that can get us safe, where we can get it fixed? Like think of a plane with like 4 engines, right? Like one blows up,
Yeah.
You have still 3 engines left. Maybe another one goes, that would be bad. But if it's like balanced across wings, I'm not an aviation engineer, but there's enough infrastructure around for airports to land or for planes of that particular type, hopefully. And even if that fails, we can try to find an open field, right? Notify everybody that we're coming. And, there's multiple ways that you keep going before there's like a complete failure, right? Like there's a much stronger thinking of like a layered set of things that need to be in place because lives are at stake. You don't want one thing to go wrong and the entire plane blows up like in like the 20s or 30s, right? Like we've gotten a little better at that. And I think that's kind of what we're doing now with cyber security. And first, I would argue in things like SRE, right? That was much more obsessed with like, can it withstand problems? Not like what happens if a problem happened and I need to fail over, right? But like, how much bad stuff can I absorb, right? Like how much of the service could I potentially turn off that's not essential to allow a critical thing to get done, right? Like in an SAP situation, you might go like, okay, there's a couple of things like, if I can queue orders for a couple of hours, that's okay, right? If it takes longer, I probably need to make sure that payment of my employees is like on a bi-weekly cycle, say. Hopefully we have it fixed before then, but potentially we could explain like, look, we're working through a major incident. We'll pay you a month later, but we need to keep the business running. So I have to get this, we have to get this part of the application running first. Otherwise we have no money to pay you at all. Right. So the questions really, and this was maybe a bit of a sidetrack that got out of the technology, but like, could you handle like what recently happened, like a massive new DDoS attack? And for how long? Like, will it knock you offline or can you recover from that? Right? Could you provide a service for several hours or even days as you cover something else? And it's like that thinking of resilient systems, especially in an industry where, like with OT, an outage is a disaster. The clock ticks. Like I remember being in a hard disk manufacturer in Thailand, where they had to react within minutes. This is, probably automated now, but it wasn't at the time. But if they didn't like intervene in a certain process, if they found impurity in the silicon platters, they had to remelt anything, cost them $300,000 at the time per minute, right? So, the cost involved of like a manufacturing system going down or like a distribution system going down is such Like you really have to start thinking like, how do you deal with these resiliency problems? I wouldn't claim that we fixed them, but like, thinking about it in a different way is very important.
Very, very important. Yeah, I like the way you described it. I think when I try to look at the whole resiliency evolution, I think that when you study the way, let's say, cloud native, and when I say cloud native, I'm looking at the transition from service-oriented architectures to microservices. You will realize that a lot of the factors when you look like the 12-factor apps, this whole thing that the guys people talked about, you will see patterns of resiliency embedded in most of what they talk about. And I think it gained traction faster for non-security computer science, if there's anything like that, where every other person apart from security, because there were a lot of open source tools like microservices came out, and all of a sudden there were a lot of open source frameworks that help people to kind of roll out microservices. And in these frameworks were resiliency patterns. When you talk about timeouts, bulkheads, all of those things were part of it. So you as a developer, you just need to, sometimes you don't really need to understand how they work. You just know they're there and they tell you, okay, make sure this and this work for that and that. When you swing to security, what I found out for cyber resiliency is there are a lot of, let's say, theoretical concepts everywhere, but how do you do it? Like, how do I do it in practice? You begin to struggle, right? People, you if you're a software and security engineer and your CISO comes and say, hey, I want you to implement cyber resilience. You say, how? Where do I even start from? What do you mean? How do I do it? And how do I measure? Like, how can I see the impact if I'm doing it correctly? And so that I think is one of the major, let's say, the limitations of cyber resiliency today. It's still there today, and it's something that has to be fixed at some point in time.
So I heard Kelly Shortridge say, and I know that you are just as much of a fan of hers and the book that she did with Aaron Reinhardt. She says operations is 10 years behind development and security is 10 years behind operations. I think that's a little harsh, but there is absolutely a grain of truth in there, right? Like if you just look at the sort of likely progression of who starts using the cloud, it's developers because it gives them a lot of freedom. So there's a direct sort of personal benefit to this, right? Like if you have to go through an infrastructure team to provision me a VM and then ask the security team to pass some other gate, and of course you're going to go first, right? Then I think operations, once people decided that, okay, just calling developers DevOps engineers maybe not quite the right thing, right? You got more focus on both the deployment and the operational aspect of DevOps without it necessarily being just operations. Or you get like an infrastructure team that handles the infrastructure, team that deploys a platform and maintains that, and a team that deploys code on top of that. What security people, I think, like it's a really interesting how this industry has started, because you could argue that it kind of grew accidentally out of sysadmins. Right, so more on the operational side, and then on the other end, you get more the hackers and security researchers. And I think there's still quite a bit of divide between sort of security researchers, policy people, cybersecurity tool vendors, and the practitioners of security operations, the one that actually have to do something with the alerts that tools produce and build the things to make things more secure, right? Like I don't think many security teams are built up yet out of engineers. Right? Like even in my situation, we worked when I wasn't yet in the security organization, I was in a sort of infrastructure security operations team where we did the engineering in collaboration with the policy people on the security side. Right? We've made some changes in the organization, and that might ultimately turn out to look a little bit differently. But by bringing the policy people, or those who set the rules, closer to the reality of the landscape itself, and pairing them with a security engineering team, and then the combination and feedback from the lines of businesses of those that you actually affect, right? It was really ultimately where the magic happened, right? If you don't take that security engineering approach and are just sitting at the sidelines, like dictating how things should be done, without the capability to achieve that, or the scanning and follow-ups to make that happen. Because we definitely got into a situation at some point where the more visibility you get, the more alerts you get, and the more that in the past was fragmented out to, say, a infrastructure team, network operations team, but now all ends up with developers. You do get this bottleneck of, here's more and more and more and more things to take care of if you don't take care of that earlier in the cycle. So we have transferred a lot of responsibilities to developers that they may not initially have felt that they were signing up for and thought that the security team was going to do, right? And that's where that coming in to enable, and not just coming in. So like, I need you to do this, I need you to do this, I need you to do this, especially when those requirements are not necessarily very well specified, right? Like it can't just be like encrypt all your data at rest. Okay, cool, but how, right? So we have instructions that says, like on GCP, that means do this, pick this option, do that thing, right? On AWS, do it in a different way. So that's really where security teams can get closer at, they actually know what they're talking about, work together with people that have exposure to the landscape. Like ideally, we're not there yet, but I would love to see it. And I'm not sure how achievable it is. But that ideally anyone who writes policy for the rest of the organization about a particular subject needs to run that and implement it themselves. That's at least the idea behind it, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a productive application, right? Maybe, but enough to have an interface that somebody can hit that needs to be up so you can check whether it's running or not, and goes through the steps of hardening the landscape to your own policies. I think that sort of practice, or if you can do that in another way through whatever interaction you have among teams, different organizations, different size and different setups, but like to get as close as practical as possible of having security teams work together with developer teams so that they actually feel that they're being helped and served, rather than here's another thing that I need you to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think developer empowerment has become a very much discussed topic. On the one hand, there's developer empowerment. On the other hand, there is the idea that security engineers, or in general security people, need to have a very good, some people say they have to be engineers. Some people say they don't need to be engineers. They need to know how to code, which makes a lot of sense. So, but just to now, I think one of the topics that brought you and I together, we started discussing intensively, was the whole issue, the topic of security chaos engineering, which we both kind of have a passion for. And so what I wanted to ask you is, I know you already said, this is not something that is practiced at SAP for obvious reasons. But the question is, in your own perspective, what's your understanding of it? of security chaos engineering, and how do you think that it could be practiced? And I'm saying this because regardless of the name, right? So I think the name itself, even Kelly herself said, if she could go back in time, she would change the name to be something else, maybe resiliency engineering or whatever, because the name itself is already a challenge to people even benefiting from what it offers. So
Yep.
keeping the name aside, what do you think are the prospects of it in modern cloud native environments or enterprises?
So what I find really interesting is that, especially when you talk about the book that kind of creates it as a whole sort of integrated practice, right? It's really based on practitioner experience, right? Like Kelly didn't just sit in isolation in an office somewhere and come up with stuff, right? That's also why there are these use cases in the end. What I think is fascinating is that we've gone through, like when I came to the cloud security operations team, what I was really surprised about was how little sort of what you might call best practices. I hate the word best practices. It's, good practices or standards. And there wasn't really anything. And so a lot of the stuff that we ended up doing was kind of just sort of cloud native or more cloud native people. We have brought a lot of young people in that knew no better. And then some enthusiastic champions like myself or Ryan Tolentino, my main sort of technical architect, security architect counterpart, that had a belief that in big lines, if you were going to be cloud, you should probably be doing things in a certain way. And then as we started, building secure platforms, setting up guardrails, building scanning tools, we implemented these approaches ourselves, right? Try to have security be an enabler, like implement these things like central logging and so on, so that the teams that we were working with saw that we were ourselves engaged in trying to fix the problem, right? Like we set targets, but especially with some of these main guardrails, they fixed alerts for our lines of business without them having to really do anything, right? Like just central logging, which I know most people don't do, and it costs a lot of money, which sucks. But we've set it up centrally, knocked 35,000 alerts at the time out of the landscape, right?
Wow.
So those are things that when teams see like, wait, we were at here, our targets is over here, and you just solved like a whole bunch of stuff. Like that's how you create these alliances and collaborations between developer teams. So we didn't know what that was called. I used to call it Seg DevOps, which was always fun when we were hiring people, because then people either thought like, oh, they just misspelled DevSecOps, would come in like, yeah, I'd like to be the security guy on a developer team. It's like, no, we're actually security operations team operating in a DevOps kind of way. And then the first time, because we were like really focused on fixing SAP for the first couple of years. And then I came across the autonomic security operations documents by Anton Chivakin and Iman Ganizada, which talked about doing things in the Security Operations Center that struck me as like, but wait, you're literally taking the same approach. Right? I still don't really like autonomic security operations because I think I get why they call it that way. I don't think it's super descriptive until you know what it means. But maybe that also goes for security chaos engineering. So it's part of the disease of our industry, perhaps. But then as we progressed and started talking to like peers in the industries, customers, started sharing our experience on conferences and got in touch with others. There was, for instance, a really interesting, I think it was the second Forward CloudSec, where me and a team member did a presentation about how we handled CSPM.
Yeah.
And there was a team from Airbnb that were discussing how they were doing vulnerability management.
Hmm.
And you could literally look at both presentations and like they are the same. Right? Like the topic is different. They had like a risk scoring engine that made more sense in their use case, but we do that ourselves as well. And they've run through the same pipelining problems, the same attribution. How do you get it to the right engineer? It's like, this is the same presentation. Right? So I felt that sort of a certain practice was starting to emerge. And then I think Kelly did us all a massive favor by putting it all together in one book, where we might be doing like, say, 6 out of the 11 or whatever the number is. Where you suddenly go like, wow, instead of trying to explain internally or to others like what we're trying to do, you could start with like, hey, just read this book. And then once you're done, you can come back and we can have a much more intelligent conversation.
Exactly.
It's fantastic to put it together in something that people can read rather than have to gather from like blogs where you kind of have to already be in the network to even know who the thought leaders are. I had that recently with some people where I've suddenly realized that our group of sort of cloud people is maybe a couple of hundred. That's actually not that big, right? If you think of the entire industry. So there's a lot more to be done to bring this not just into the developer community, simply as a handbook for software quality, just read that, right? And on the other hand, to security teams to understand both what developers are doing, but also what is expected of them in a modern cloud era.
Absolutely. I think the book from Kelly and Aaron is very instructive, and it's not just like any other book. It's written in a way that allows for ease of understanding. It challenges a lot of, let's say, established ways people work. And of course, it brings in a lot of discussions. People get to think or rethink about what they've been doing, to really question whether it's the right way to operate. And as you mentioned, it's a book. So rather than, which is one of the challenges you have when you're bringing in change to an organization, people say, who are you? Who are you to bring the change? Why should you be the one suggesting the change? And can you explain again what you said? There's a book, just go there. It's written by a renowned author. She has this X amount of experience. By the way, there is this X amount of people who also think the book is nice. So just go there.
Probably correct. Like I've had a number of times, it's actually in a slide that I present in Copenhagen in a couple of weeks, that shows like the dialogue that is happening in IT departments everywhere right now, right? And has been over the last couple of years, where like the debate is between, for lack of better terms, data center people and cloudy people, right? Where the data center guy says like, okay, we have ITIL, we have governance boards for changes, we have like a whole series of process systems, like, I'm fully organized. And you tell me I shouldn't be doing that in the cloud. It's like, no, man, adopt a cloud native mindset. And, we're still working on the practices and we have to reinterpret how we do things. And it's like, who are you? Like, based on what? Like, I have like this body of organizations behind me, NIST, you can go to school for the stuff that I do. What about you? Like, no, this is just what we learned along the way, right? Which makes us sound like complete cowboys. And the sad reality is that we're both right, right? Because the cloudy people are correct. You have to do it that way. It's much better. It's new, it's scary, it's different, and you have to learn a lot. But once you get that spark, you go like, okay, that of course that's the way. And that is how we'll solve the problems that we haven't been able to solve over the last 20, 30 years. But to get there, yeah, we have to find a way to explain that we're not mystical idiots, right? Like that the person with this structured approach is correct when he says it has to be compliant, right? Like we have to make sure that, you know, we pass an audit of some kind, especially if you're in
Yeah.
regulated industries or serve regulated industries. So what the book has done is help sort of describe not exactly how you would translate that, but like it gives you the basis to then go and even be able to tell an auditor, like, look, I did it this way to fulfill that particular control. And here is, you know, some modern book that helps justify and helps explain that why that actually satisfies that control.
Yeah. Wow.
And
Thank
now
you so
let's
much.
hope that there's some, you know, cloud security NIST standard or ISO standard or something kind of get built on top of that, right? So that we get
Exactly.
like a NIST 800 cyber security software engineering or something like that.
That will be really, that will bring the whole thing to full circle, because there are certain sets of people. I don't blame them, but it has to be compliance or a kind of regulation before they even consider it. They're just the way they are. So
Yeah, and the thing is that part of the challenge that we have in security is that we've been talking about risk-based security for about a decade at least.
yeah,
We don't actually do it, right? Like the default when it comes down to, you know, the sort of the shop floor, if you like, it's
mm,
still kind of we have to cover everything.
yeah,
And this is a really difficult thing to adjust to. That goes beyond even like your own security team, but also like the security teams of your customers. Like you're not going to fix everything. Well, I'm probably not going to prioritize the library that is not even loaded in memory in a host that is 5 layers deep in the landscape that is unreachable in any kind of legitimate way versus something that requires my attention a lot more. And that is quite difficult to explain, that you might not fix everything, right? Like how do you deal with having a vulnerability management program where just because of the operational inertia that happens and the fact that every day new CVEs come out, that you're
yeah,
going to have to tolerate a certain amount of vulnerabilities in your landscape. Obviously, you have to do this intelligently, right? Like, don't leave like the criticals, right? But like, you know, make a good priority consideration of where you're going to direct your resources first, so that you take care of the big stuff, right? Like one thing that I get really irritated about is this sort of some of these security dogmas, right? One of them is like an attacker, defenders have to be right all the time, attackers have to be right only once.
one, yeah,
Okay, you tell me which one, you know, remote code execution gives me access to your crown jewels on the first try, right? Like
yeah,
that doesn't happen, right? Like there's always a sequence. Like you could just look at the whole sort of MITRE attack framework to get a sense of how many chances defenders have to get it right, right?
it's
And
endless.
how often, how much noise attackers need to make to get to anywhere that's really significant, right? So we have to take those things into account when we're accurately applying priorities and use the context of the landscape to focus where we're demanding the attention from developers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, the discussion has been really, 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 really nice. And from what you
Oh
have
my
said,
God, we're out of time.
yeah, we're already out of time, but all good. I think, I mean, I already have a couple of follow-up possible, let's say, discussion topics. And I really believe we will have to invite you for another webinar, because you have a lot to share, you have a lot of experience, and you already mentioned about some topics that are definitely interesting for the audience. But I think for today, since we already run out of time, I want to thank you so much, Jay, for sharing with us, for coming on this platform. We have learned a lot, and I think that definitely we will see questions either from the recording, which we are going to be posting on YouTube, and I believe we're going to be getting questions from people, and hopefully we will channel those questions to you if we cannot respond ourselves. So thank you so much for coming, and I wish you a very nice day.
My pleasure, and thanks everybody.
All right, thanks.